thus far. What we think, Madam Speaker and ladies and gentlemen, at this point in the debate, we need to be able to evaluate the strategic positioning of the Occupy Wall Street movement in terms of the potency of its message and its capability to enforce change in the future. What we're going to argue coming from opening government is that in terms of the strategy and tack that the Occupy Wall Street movement must take right now, we do not think that it should continue protesting, having these physical protests in Wall Street right now. We need to characterize what's happening in the status quo. If we take a look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, it's been gaining a lot of momentum. What we think with this momentum has been negative media coverage, focusing and exposing the increasing crackdowns on the Wall Street protests in these particular areas. We think, Madam Speaker, that what this only tells us is that the situation here is already volatile. And we think that at this point, there is going to be no marginal benefit in terms of staying here, no thank you, in terms of increasing the potency of the movement. We think, Madam Speaker, that generally speaking, when violence erupts in these areas because of these protests, which we think is probably a relatively likely situation, we think that you necessarily downplay the significance of the movement. So what exactly do we want to do coming from opening government? No, thank you, sir. We will not stop the movement entirely. We think that the movement should still continue redressing its grievances and making the faults of the 1% known to the rest of the world. But we think that we should stop protesting at Wall Street. We think that we should lobby in Congress instead, but we think we should bring it to social media. And we think that we should utilize these other avenues, no thank you, that are less volatile but equally potent for the movement. We think that the movement fundamentally should continue challenging status quo, but not through protest on Wall Street. The standards that we're going to adjudicate this debate by an opening government are quite simple. Number one, will withdrawing from Wall Street necessarily address the problems raised by the movement? And number two, what exactly is the best strategic positioning intact for the movement in terms of its potency? I'm going to have three levels of analysis for you in today's debate. The first thing I want to talk about is this idea of how the purpose of the Occupy Wall Street movement protests have already been achieved right now. If we take a look at how the movement has been able to cause other effects of the movement, it's basically managed to spark discourse and incentivize similar movements in places like Boston and Washington. But why is a movement like this? If we take a look at the purpose of the movement, ladies and gentlemen, it's only to raise awareness of the problems with the status quo without the financial crisis was dealt with the unjust bailouts and the unjust executive bonuses and the flaws basically, and how the 1% is treated and how the 99% is treated. No, thank you. If we take a look at the positioning of the Wall Street movement right now, there is no clear, coherent platform because they believe that they want to consider the movement and to allow the movement to grow as broadly as possible. We think that the purpose of the movement is not to pass specific legislation, but to change how inequality is fundamentally viewed in these particular places. So we think, no thank you, that when the Occupy Wall Street movement asks for specific demands, you necessarily limit the scope of what the movement is capable of changing. Because more than anything, Occupy Wall Street, Madam Speaker, is a symbol. And that's why it includes a wide demographic of people. It includes transit unions, includes pilots, it includes students. All these people have different concerns with the status quo. No thank you, no thank you, Dara. And that's why the purpose of the movement simply is to raise awareness and not necessarily to push for any concrete legislation for the very broad scope that the movement, no thank you, is already calling for. So we think, Madam Speaker, that there is no marginal benefit in staying there because we think that firstly, it's already made the problem very clear to the people in the status quo. And secondly, Madam Speaker, we don't think that staying there will increase awareness or increase debate more than it already has. So we think that it's basically fulfilled the purpose of the protest, to get the debates going and to get people talking. And we think that that's the very purpose of the movement to begin with. But the second question that I want to answer is, why is it strategic to withdraw at this particular point? We recognize, Madam Speaker, that while it is important to change particular policies, that the Occupy Wall Street movement is trying to address, we need to understand also that the situation of these protests, no thank you, is getting increasingly volatile. Because what we've been seeing in the news is the increasing repression of the movement by the police. We've seen the police cracking down on the movement here and there. We think that protests only have a certain threshold before it becomes a riot. Because we think that you cannot always control the situation of the protest to keep it peaceful and to keep no thank you, and to keep the angry mob from doing something violent and from doing something irrational. We think, Madam Speaker, that when there is a riot, it fundamentally removes the legitimacy or decreases the legitimacy of the movement. Because when it's going to be seen as violent, think it's going to be able to be misconstrued by the media as something that's just a bunch of angry people who have no real direction or who have no real gripe at the very end of the day. So we think that when the media and when the state has the leeway to show that this angry mob is just causing trouble and does not have any legitimate concerns, we think that you necessarily reduce the potency of the movement directly.
Will moving out of Wall Street give the people who are angry and have legitimate concerns enough representation compared to your Congress model?
We think that the very purpose of the movement, again, is to spark debate and to make sure that people understand the inequality that's happening in the system. So we think that with or without protests in Wall Street, if the Occupy Wall Street movement still exists, then there will still be an incentive for policymakers to make sure that the gripes of these people are going to be addressed at the very end of the day. So we think that we're not necessarily reducing the potency of the movement, but we're keeping the image of the movement as a symbol of the inequality that's actually happening in status quo. But lastly, I want to talk about the international perception of the movement and why it's particularly important for the movement to maintain this good international positioning. If we take a look at countries like Greece, like Spain, like the Philippines, the Occupy Wall Street movement is being misused in different countries in different ways. We don't want these particular protests to be associated with the Occupy Wall Street movement because like the Occupy Wall Street movement protests, these protests in other countries are also volatile, also have the possibility to be violent. So when these international protests become violent, the international community and everybody in general has the leeway to place the blame on the original movement. And we think that when you do that, you destroy what the movement stood for. But if you try to understand why it's harmful in the very first place, we think the priority of the movement is to keep its image and potency as a symbol of protest against the tyranny of the 1%. And we think that the only way you do that is to keep it peaceful. Because when you stop protests now, it becomes less likely for the Occupy Wall Street movement to be associated with these possibly violent protests outside in the international community. What you can do coming from opening government thus far is quite simple. Number one, it has done what it needs to do in terms of informing people about inequality. But secondly, we think that there is a high likelihood that it will become a violent protest, and we think that in effect reduces the potency of the movement. And because we believe that the regresses of these people will still be addressed with or without these physical protests on Wall Street itself, we're proud of people.